what I've learned so far. This video will deal with some serious issues that I am not at all qualified to talk about, so trigger and sensitivity warnings apply. While I've been world building for 20 plus years, I'm learning that world building for an interactive world is different. When a world is just for me, it's easy enough to add or change information in a Word document and adapt the world around it. Options for changing the world are a bit more limited when it's a shared world, and changing it would impact additional lore. When I started out, I wanted Efoqar to be based on the 30 Years' War, which I didn't know enough about, and wanted to use the development of this world as a vehicle to learn more about it. As with most things, as I learned more, I also learned how little I knew. I started out with a reading list of 5 books to familiarize myself with the topic. I'm currently on the 7th book. I have added additional books beyond that, and I'm looking for more on other topics that will give me more background. I've realized that Efoqar can't be a true fantasy analog for the 30 Years' War, or at least I don't want it to be. The complexities of the events make me realize that I can't do justice, and the geography doesn't quite work out either. More on that later, though. More and more I realize that if I wanted to do the fantasy equivalent of anything in the real world, it would have been better just to add the fantasy elements to those events. Basically be an elf and cast spells at the sack of Magdeburg if you want. However, if we play in that world, it will either take away some player agency by confining them to predefined events that they can't change, or go full alternate history, and with the introduction of magic I might as well be rewriting Eric Flint's 1632 series, which I have not read and know I probably should given the genre I'm using. So the solution is that Efoqar, more specifically Eastern Klassen, is not based on, but rather loosely inspired by the 30 Years' War. It is a small difference, but one that makes me feel better about the lack of knowledge on my part and gives the players and myself more agency in the world. On the matter of geography, I have always recognized the impact it has on history, but I'm not sure if I ever truly appreciated it. I originally made Efoqar in Campaign Cartographer 3, and when I did, I used a random generator for the main land masses, because I'd spent years fiddling with maps on other builds I've done, and I wanted to move on. I also thought it would give me an opportunity to base some of the world building around the map versus basing the map around the world building. Hence, another difference between recognizing and appreciating the impact of geography. The side effect is that sometimes geography gets in the way of storytelling. One example is Pericol. The way the shadow range blocks Pericol means that the interactions are more limited on the political side, or at least force me to be more creative. So in this instance, it may be a bit of a hindrance, but it isn't necessarily a bad thing. I also would have liked to have a border between Tallinn and Kenyer, and while I can't have a border everywhere I would like, I think the intersection of Pericol, Kenyer, Ashuna, and Tallinn is a place I would redo if I would completely start over. Where I really feel like I boxed myself in is my poor representation of the analogs of Persia and Ottoman Empire, as well as earlier caliphates. This, however, goes beyond geography and starts playing with time as the limiting factor. When looking at Eastern Klassen, after the map was done, even before we played in Efoqar, I quickly realized that it wasn't complex enough to represent Europe in the 17th century. Despite this, I still feel it was a better effort than what I did with the continent of Erlasora. I had originally set it up to be the Ottoman and Persian empires with the Indian subcontinent and the equivalent in the south. Problem was, I also wanted to include something similar to the Umayyad and particularly the Abbasid Caliphate, even though those would have been from an earlier time in our real world. I can justify their existence by pointing out that the Oghai, or Mongol equivalent, are on a different landmass and so didn't sack the equivalent of Baghdad. The truth is that I wanted them to be included, and so I made it work that way. To do this without adjusting the land masses, I was forced to make some sacrifices, including equivalents of the Umayyad Sultanate and the Seljuk Turks. The same can be said about the Oghai, who continue to endure and even thrive as an empire on Efoqar, whereas the Mongol Empire had long since broken up by the 17th century. Without the breakup of the Oghai, the smaller khanates and kingdoms wouldn't emerge that were such a key part of the great game between the British and Russian empires in our own world. In an attempt to mitigate this, I tried to make room for the Khanates in the north by reassigning those cultures to an area that had no population. And yes, I realize how problematic that language is, but strap in because it's going to get worse. So for now, I just get to cosplay as the British Empire and draw lines on maps. Shout out to Sir Radcliffe and the like. This will either limit the planned expansion of the Russian equivalent or force conflict with other cultures, as perhaps the Russian equivalent movement forces the Khanate equivalents to move south and displace Oghai. I also feel like I missed out on the Byzantines and will likely be adding something akin to them as I go back through and fine-tune some of these lands. We've discussed the interaction of geography and history and the inconvenience it has produced. Where it gets more problematic is when I represent cultures and how I attempted to do that. Even in a fantasy world, there are some problems with practical implementation that I just can't overcome. I can't represent all cultures from all times, and I understand that, and I'm okay with the trade-offs I've had to make in order to make it work. Where it gets uncomfortable is how I choose to represent different cultures. On Efoqar, there are no inherently good or evil species, so I don't think much about assigning fantasy species to real-world equivalents. The elves are French, no big deal. The gnomes are German, fine. The orcs are Russian. I didn't mean anything by it, but I understand how it could be an issue. Saying goblins and orcs, etc., are just like everyone else is fine in a small group, but I feel like this, if were ever opened up to a larger audience, it would prompt some reactions in the response to the idea of these traditionally evil species as meaning that those cultures that are associated with on Efoqar are evil as well, which in no way was my intention. There are also examples of cross-cultural interaction. For example, there are elves and gnomish or orcish lands that I put in place to be the equivalent of families displaced by border shifts and migration. Many times in our own history, you'll see something to the effect of a Russian commander with a German surname fighting against a German commander with a French surname. This method was convenient when world building, but it was certainly also lazier than just mixing the different species together and assigning cultures on geography alone. That method would have made it also easier to add new species at later dates, like when the 5e Spelljammer supplement came out and I wanted to add plasmoids from it. The fact that so far my campaigns on Efoqar have taken place in Eastern Clausen, again a European equivalent, has certainly let me skirt around some of the other issues as well, mainly my ignorance of regions in our own world. This isn't malicious on my part, but it is a continuation of the education system I grew up in. And the problems built into that are outside the scope of what I've learned while world building and running tabletop RPGs on Efoqar. But it still leaves several cultures from Earth underrepresented on Efoqar, most notably from sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the South Pacific Oceania and indigenous American cultures. Religion on Efoqar has been interesting, but there's not an equivalent to the papacy's influence. I've created a religious center, but have found it too far removed from the current campaign and its power struggles to be of much use story-wise. I do have some possible ideas of adding another center of power to the Pantheon, but have yet to work out the details in a way that makes its introduction feel organic. Focusing on European equivalents, part of the lore I've written into the world that has been the most uncomfortable to narrate are the Genasi and the Gnolls. On Efoqar, both are persecuted peoples without a homeland. The original intention was for the Genasi to take on the role of the Jewish diaspora. The derogatory stereotype of the Jewish banker is not something I'm anxious to propagate, but Jews in Europe became bankers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance because other avenues were closed to them because of prejudice. These same people that were persecuted would go on to save several kingdoms, including Spain and France, from financial ruin. And so I didn't want to limit those contributions either. In Efoqar, I'd originally planned for the Genasi to fill the role more as artisans to somewhat circumvent this reprehensible stereotype. The Gnolls on Efoqar were to represent the Romani people, a people with a rich history and culture that is weaved all throughout Eurasia and North Africa, spanning not just geography but religions and languages, and leaving impressions of their own. A culture that so many have traditionally dismissed or maligned, and the fact is that it's a key part of the history of the lands they've inhabited. On Efoqar, Gnolls, who are humanoid hyenas, were meant to be nomadic and fill the role of hyenas that help clean up certain cities or communities in Africa and are respected for it. In this sense, they would show up before or after a disaster to help rebuild. They would also tend to the dead, helping stop the spread of disease and providing proper and respectful burials, cremations, or other ceremonies for the dead. This tied into other historically maligned groups that dealt with death, like the Dalit of India or the Moroccan of Japan. I wanted to give them a Romani aesthetic because I thought the collection of different styles and iconography from the regions they traveled through made them feel distinct but also familiar at the same time. This, of course, fell into the stereotype of wandering, and I do apologize for the use of the term gypsy. To ignore or remove these threads from the tapestry seems cruel, but I've tried playing the prejudice in the game recently with these groups being blamed for a plague coming to a city, and it just feels cruel. I don't like the idea of ignoring these marginalized groups in my narrative, but I'm concerned that my attempts to represent them almost comes across as disingenuous or even as torture porn. It leaves me with the same disgust as the idea of being promoted by some politicians in the United States that American slavery had its upsides because it could teach skills that could be used later, as if the end of a whip was the only way that those skills could be taught, or many didn't already have those skills when they were enslaved and removed from their homes. To ignore centuries of oppression seems terrible, but at the same time, it feels like I'm being an apologist for bigotry by saying, well, it's always been present, and I don't like either option and need to find a better way. I just don't know what it is yet. I'm also unsure how to incorporate more stateless nations into the world. I have a few examples of them, but certainly not enough to represent all the stateless cultures that I would like to include. This exercise has made me realize there are other things that I and the larger ttrpg community leave out. For example, we are okay with violence as a key part of the game, but not sexual violence, and have left it out of our stories. This may be because I've chosen to focus on broader aspects of my world building at this point, and traditionally sexual violence is considered more individualized in the education system where I was raised. Although I imagine relatively recent groups like the comfort women taken by the Japanese Imperial Army or North American indigenous peoples affected by the staggering numbers of missing and murdered indigenous women would dispute this, to say nothing of other groups past and present. Still, I leave sexual violence out of my game, and I'm okay with that. I don't want it to be there, and I would hate to have to act it out in the narration. There's also no homophobia or transphobia in my world. Again, why would I want there to be sexual violence or homophobia or transphobia in this world? But the problem is that even though I'm struggling with facilitating or liberating racism in the world of Efoqar, I seem to be okay with tribalism on some level. Does this say something about me or the ttrpg community as a whole? I'm not sure. I do know that some of the actual play shows that I love have spent a lot of time and money to ensure that they are inclusive and open to anyone to access those universes. There are some amazing creators who are addressing these issues far better than I am. Mark Thompson, who made the combat wheelchair mechanics, deserves a special shout out because he let me include my late sister in my world in a way I never considered, though I still find Efoqar lacking in neurodivergent representation as well. I don't have the money to hire sensitivity consultants, nor would it be practical for a group of 3 that makes up my core game party. And my reading list is already larger than I can handle and still growing. Instead, I lay my thoughts out here by shouting them into the void. Why do I include some things I feel deserve to be recognized, like the suffering of certain people, or make sure that people are included through representation and awareness, but others aren't because it makes it uncomfortable for me? Where's that line and what goes on what side? All this has made me question some of my future campaign ideas as well. One of my ideas for a campaign was built on the idea of examining the rise of national identity in the 19th century. I'm not so keen on the idea of dividing sides up by nationality now. Instead, I will probably choose to focus on that potential campaign on the revolutions of 1848 that, again, I don't know much about, and will have to increase my reading list again. Would it have been better to set my game in a small region that was made up of heterogeneous city-states? Probably, but also would have been far less interesting. But perhaps that's why so many fantasy novel settings and the like are set in similar situations. It just makes it more accessible. There seem to be three paths open to me when dealing with these issues. One is to make the world that the conflict is largely interpersonal. No racism, no homophobia, no ableism, etc. Here the conflict arises simply from personalities of the participants. A Schitt's Creek type of world, or sticking to the fantasy vibe, Dimension 20's A Court of Fae and Flowers. Two is to make Efoqar as nasty as the real world with all of its faults. After all, heroes need something to fight against to make the world better, and the point of this exercise was to learn about a terrible time in history. This would be a Song of Ice and Fire approach, but with more diversity and probably more prejudice. The problem with the first approach is that I'm not as inventive of a storyteller as Dan and Eugene Levy, or as skilled of a GM like Abria Iyengar in order to pull this off. I might have an idea of where to go, but not how to get there. As for the second, I don't think I have the constitution of George R.R. Martin to even attempt to give that world the justice it deserves. This leaves option 3, that we'll call the Star Trek approach. It acknowledges the issues that we have been talking about, but deals with them in a more family-friendly or prime-time sort of way. It is a difficult needle to thread, but one we will give our best shot to. It also provides a good example of a living world that adapts to the real world and changes lore with new stories while respecting what came before. A term I learned while typing this up is hyperobject, a word that comes from Timothy Morton's The Ecological Thought. My reading list continues to grow. And describes something so big it becomes hard to grasp its entirety. A fancy way of saying you fell down the rabbit hole, which describes most of my hobbies. The hyperobject is the intersection of culture, geography, and history applied to my fantasy world is of no real consequence to anyone but me. My players don't watch these videos, and it just provides a record for me to refer back to in the development of my world. This does not mean that there isn't room for improvement. I'm proud of the work I've done on Efoqar, but it can still be better. Some of these issues I don't have a fix for, but I'm working on making the best I can. Some of the issues won't be fixed in this world at all, and I'll have to be taken as a lesson for the next one. But some will be fixed here. Efoqar is a living document, and I'm not sure where it will end up.